can start to get ready here. Anybody that hasn't already got their hasn't got their 50/50 tickets, they're in the back. They're $1 a piece, and we're happy to sell you all if you like. Also, there's door prizes, so please get your name in the bucket for the door prizes for the. Do we have any first-time people here? Anybody here for the first time? Welcome, glad you're here. What we're going to do tonight, I want to get started. Burton Beasley from Gaston County Beekeepers has been kind enough to come to talk to us about Sustainable Apiary Techniques. And I'm going to start talking. Burton, would you? Sure. I'll let you get started. I'll leave it up there. You can take it out of there.
Yeah, I'll move it down a little bit. Hold up taller than I am. As mentioned tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about Sustainable Apiary Techniques. Going to kind of breeze through some different topics. It's not really going to be necessarily this season specific, but we will touch on topics that are going to be beneficial for this season, but broad across all season techniques that will be beneficial for new beekeepers, but also beekeepers every year that are having to buy new packages, new nukes. So we're going to talk a little bit about understanding some of the kind of functions that we need to adapt to and techniques that we need to utilize as beekeepers in order to quit having to shell out all that money every year for new bees. So that's kind of where we're going to go with our Sustainable Apiary Techniques. So a little bit about me. I'm Burton Beasley. I do DBA. My apiary is Burt's Bees Honey Company right now. But right now I have a trademark dispute with the Burt's Bees Company, or even though I've been operating for 14 years as Burt's Bees Honey Company, Clorox finally discovered me and they didn't like it too much. So soon to be changing to Beasley's Honey Company. But right now I'm the current second Vice President of the North Carolina State Beekeepers Association. Before that, I was a regional director for 4 years. So I tried to get out, but then they pulled me back in, as they say. I'm a little bit beyond what you would consider your normal backyard beekeeper. You know, if you think about how beekeeping is broke down, you have your backyard hobbyists, you have sideliners, which is what I fit into. I have a normal 9-to-5 job, Monday through Friday. I get off of work, go back to work. I do run my business to supplement my income, so I'm doing queens, nukes, honey production, pollination services, and that's how we do it down there at the bottom, one strawberry at a time. And I manage on average somewhere in between 100 and 200 colonies. I kind of trimmed back last year to about 1 to 150, but when I start running mating nukes and producing nukes for everybody to buy, I'm usually up 200 or 200 plus sometimes. So a lot of work, but certainly very enjoyable working with the bees. What's going on with the NCSBA? As you all know, because most of you probably tuned in, we had our web series this spring, but I do want to talk about what we're going to have going on this summer and this fall. Everybody's already been asking, are we going to have a fall state meeting, or a summer state meeting, excuse me. Most likely we're looking at pushing that meeting to the fall, so September or November is when we're looking at dates to potentially have a state meeting. And yes, we are looking to have it in person. We're supposed to have a meeting on it next week to vote on it. Potential sites are Blue Ridge Community College that we've been to before up in Flat Rock. Don't know whether that facility is going to be available. We have some dates available for Hickory, North Carolina, where we've had it before. And then also there is a facility open in Fayetteville. I'm trying to steer them away from that just because we canceled our summer meeting last year. That was in the mountain region. It would have been close for most of our Piedmont mountain region people, and I just don't think it's fair that we're going to go back next spring and be in New Bern, and then we've already been there a couple times and have to cancel out for all of our folks back this way. So trying to push for Hickory, or possibly we were also looking at maybe if Lake Junaluska was available. And what we're looking at doing this year is, with it being such a short window, is probably just lining up major speakers, cutting it back to a 2-day event, not doing all the breakout, workshop kind of sessions, but having main speakers over a course of 2 days and try to get some really good talent in there to be interesting for everybody. So that's kind of what's going on with the state, and be on the lookout. I know Mark asked me when I come in, y'all do have a regional director, and y'all's regional director for this chapter is with the state is Brian Fisher. So for those of you that know Brian, he is your kind of your go-between between the state board there. So he's the guy, so you aggravate him. You know Brian. So as mentioned, we're going to talk about sustainable apiary techniques. A lot of this we're not going to get some subjects we're not really going to get super in depth on, because they would be a whole talk in themselves, or a whole series of talks, or a series of talks and workshops. But basically, we're going to touch briefly on subjects and kind of hit on the stuff that you need to know. And one thing I always include in all of my talks and all of my presentation is things to consider before we begin. So you as a beekeeper, you have different goals, you have different management styles, you have different management techniques, and your goals are not the same as my goals. So every year, whether you're going to keep doing what you've been doing or whether you're going to try something different, you need to analyze what your goals are going to be. Is it going to be this year you want to produce a huge honey crop? Well, you need to keep the bees in the box, keep them from swarming in order to produce that big honey crop. Is it going to be to pollinate your garden? You want some beehives out to pollinate your garden, fruits, vegetables, your trees, bushes. Is it going to be that you want to actually go out and pollinate somebody that's got a berry farm or something? And so all of that takes equipment, takes time, resources. So you have to be available to do that. Is it going to be, you've got 10 hives and you want to go to 25, or you've got 6 hives and you want to go to 10? That takes extra equipment, extra frames, extra places to put bees. If you don't have a big yard or a big lot to put them on, all things you got to evaluate. Is it going to be that you want to try raising queens? You're tired of buying $35, $40, $50 queens and having them shipped in and paying the extra shipping money. So you're going to need queen rearing stuff, whether that's nuke boxes, or whether it's queen castles, or whether it's grafting tools or graftless, and we'll talk more about that kind of stuff. Biggest thing there is you need to examine what your goal is going to be for the year. Make sure you have the equipment in advance, and I'll say that right now with all this COVID crap that's been going on, delays in getting your equipment, your jars, all that stuff have been even more so a problem. So make sure you have it in advance and have it in hand and have it ready to go. So the biggest problem we face, as you know, the apiary inspectors harp on it. Most of your beekeepers and chapters harp on it, are the Varroa mites. But I cannot overly stress that you need to be sampling at least quarterly for your Varroa mite levels. And then especially if you're going to be applying some type of a treatment, then you definitely need to be doing a mite check before and post, at least 2 weeks after the treatment, just to verify that it actually did work. Mite sampling methods, sugar shake, alcohol wash, sticky board are all accepted methods. Sugar shake and alcohol wash are the two most popular methods and the two most accepted methods as far as giving you a better mite count, and at least you're not sitting there counting all those little mites on the little white Corex piece of plastic. So other thing with Varroa mites, you need to be able to understand there comes a point where they're going to exceed an economic threshold. So there comes a point where you cross a point of no return, or a point where the damage that they're going to do or the viruses that they're going to vector are going to be a problem for your colonies. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of slides. And then, you know, I don't want to harp on using chemicals in your hive, but there are certainly ways to get around using chemical controls. But, you know, I'll use the analogy of a child. If your child is sick, you're going to take them to the doctor, or you're going to give them the medication that they need. And sometimes I find that beekeepers say, well, you know, the bees have the Varroa, they're going to deal with them, or they're not. And if they don't, well, they'll just die. And I wouldn't do that with my child. You know, well, they're not strong enough, so they'll just die. So sometimes it comes to a point where you have to treat the bees to get them by, and do so if you need to. Food and nutrition, again, that's another issue we face. You know, whether there's enough quality forage out there. This nice cold snap that we had here the last few days is probably not too good for our poplar blooms that were starting to open up, and then of course other things like our crimson clover that's been up. So we may end up having to supplement bees. Understanding that, you know, if there's not enough available nutrition, that you may have to supplement your bees, or when to supplement with feeding substitutes, whether that's 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, depending on the time of year, or whether that's adding supplemental pollen or pollen substitutes at certain points in the year. Another big issue that we've been seeing a big rise in, and the North Carolina State Queen Clinic is doing a lot of investigation into, is queen and colony failures due to queen issues. We have seen in the last 5 years a big spike in the amount of queen failures going into not only fall, but coming out of winter into early spring, and then the colony starts crashing because you've got nobody in there laying eggs, no expanding population. That is a very real problem. The longevity of queens longevity of productiveness of queens has seemed to be an issue seems to be a growing issue the last 5 years, and then even evidence. So if you look at the Bee Informed Partnership, they have a lot of beekeepers nationwide that are reporting queen failure. So we know there's some kind of issue there. We don't really understand why we're seeing the issues, but the good folks like Dr. Tarpey and Brad Metz at NC State are doing a lot of work with the queens and trying to look at why we are seeing these failures. But and then disease and pest identification, proper pest identification. Whether you're an experienced beekeeper or a new beekeeper, a lot of times situations are misdiagnosed or not properly diagnosed, and so we don't properly get control of what issues there. We'll talk more about that as well. Good resources if you're in terms of Varroa management. The Honeybee Health Coalition would be probably my go-to. University of Minnesota, of course, also has really great resources. But the good thing about the Honeybee Health Coalition, if you haven't visited their website, they have what they call a Varroa Management Gun. It's got detailed information on implementing integrated pest management strategies. It's got efficacies on all positive controls that you want to implement. It's got efficacies on all the chemical controls that we have available on the market, and then it has all sorts of nice little detailed videos available so that you can actually look, see, and understand how to apply those products, when to apply them. And then there's lots of research studies on there, ongoing stuff, what they're looking at for hive management and Varroa control. But then also, of course, all the detailed stuff there with the miticides is really great. And if you don't know how to do mite sampling, there's great videos on the website there of how to actually do a sugar shake or how to do an alcohol wash and how to do it properly. So really great resource. If you've never done any of that stuff and you got questions, really great resource to go to. Bee Informed Partnership, again, with them, they have a lot of surveys that they're doing not just on a national level, but they do state level and then even regional inside the state. So you can actually pull up the state of North Carolina on their survey, and you can look at the Piedmont of North Carolina, and it's got beekeepers that are reporting, whether they're larger beekeepers like me, whether it's hobbyists, or whether it's semi-commercial, commercial beekeepers that are doing these surveys that are participating, and anybody can participate. Anybody in this room can participate in the surveys, and I urge you to, because that's all good data that's going to be collected, and it's available. And I know you have to kind of sort through some of the data, look at it, but you can look at certain beekeepers in your area that are reporting low losses over wintering, and you can look back and see what were their management practices throughout the year. Were they putting pollen substitute in? When did they put pollen substitute in? Were they doing brood breaking? Were they doing drone trapping? Were they using miticides? What miticide did they use? So it's all great information that's within those surveys, and you can be a part of it and share your data. And then also they have a lot of, again, management videos, management studies, and then research studies that they're doing on whether it's management, Varroa management, or feeding supplement. They're doing a lot of feeding supplement kind of research right now, so another great resource to tune into. I put this up here. This is right from that Varroa Management Gun off of the Honeybee Health Coalition, and then that's that economic threshold that we talked about. You know, our curve, our bee population. You know, we're peaking June, July, and we start curving back. So you have to understand that that Varroa curve is also growing. If the bees are building up earlier in the spring, like they have the last few years, then that Varroa curve is also building up earlier in the year. So what we're doing, our aim as beekeepers, whether we're going to implement integrated pest management, positive controls, or whether we're going to do that in conjunction with a chemical strategy, is to make that blue curve go way down. So we're trying to push that down such that we never reach this point where it's going to be a major problem or the colony could be lost. So that's just what I want you to take away from that. The importance of your mite sampling, again, right from the Honeybee Health Coalition. This time of the year when we're in our population growth, what your apiary inspectors are going to tell you, and then also what the data is showing is right now, if you took a mite sample, you shouldn't be having per 100 bees more than about 1 to 2 mites. Otherwise, you've got a major mite situation right now, and you need to get it under control. You know, later in the season, and we're talking about that June-ish, late June, July, 2 to 3 mites is about what you would expect, and anything more than that, we should be implementing some kind of control, whether that's brood breaking or whatever. We need to be implementing some kind of controls to get those mite levels under control. Varroa, everybody's sick of hearing about it, but it is a big problem, so we talk about it. As mentioned, if you're going to be applying some kind of treatment, you need to be rechecking your mite levels 2 weeks post-treatment in most cases, and then we have seen some pockets of certain miticides that don't know that it's resistance. We have had some products that have had some issues with their quality control. The Amatraz product, Apiary, a couple of years ago had a quality control issue on certain batches, and so it was relatively ineffective. But if you just put the strips in and you didn't go back and recheck, well, a lot of beekeepers, their colonies started crashing a month after they took the strips back out. And so you can't always rely on that chemical product's going to work unless you go back and actually take the time to recheck your mite loads. And then I will mention the other thing that a lot of us are seeing now, whether that's due to mite levels building up earlier in the season. A lot of larger beekeepers like myself have adopted a biannual treatment where we're doing like a summer and late fall secondary treatment, trying to use the lighter chemicals that are available, but just to get some additional knockdown, because we were seeing treatments, and the mite levels were fine, and then all of a sudden, we rechecked in September, early October, and then the mite levels have spiked back up. So there's still lots of cat brood there, so it could just be that emergence, but we have been seeing, well, a lot of us have been having to do secondary treatments, and so that really hurts your pocketbook when you're having to do that on 150 or 200 colonies. I do want you to be aware that it would be better if you're implementing some positive stuff throughout the year, whether that's brood breaking, drone trapping, things that would fit into your IPM strategy. Our region, and where I'm at, is technically considered a mountain region, but I'm kind of borderline on Piedmont, but a lot of beekeepers in our area haul bees in July or June and July up for the sourwood crop. That offers a unique problem, and particularly because now you have a short window. You've got to get all your spring honey off. You've got to get the bees hauled to the mountains where you're going to put them for the sourwood crop. And so you're very limited in what you can use as a control on the mite levels before you haul the bees up for sourwood flow. So you're kind of limited there to oxalic or maybe a formic depending on the temperature. So that does create a unique problem if you're going to haul bees and try to get sourwood honey. Do you try and get something in that short window, or do you just let it ride and then treat at the end of the sourwood flow? So it does create a problem sometimes when we see some really high mite loads by the time the sourwood flows over. And then why do we harp on Varroa mites so much? Well, if you've seen any of Samuel Ramsey's information that's come out the last few years, for years and years we were going under the premise that mite fed on hemolymph for the blood of the bee, and now we know that it actually feeds on the fat bodies or the vitellogenin in the bee. And so why is that important? Well, if we've got bees that are being produced in the fall of the year that are going to be our winter bees that are going to be clustered because it's going to be cool, they rely on those fat, that fat that's stored in their body, those fat bees, what we call winter bees. They rely on those fat cells to be able to, if they can't break cluster, to actually get over and get a little honey, or their sisters can't get over there and get honey to feed them. Well, now they can actually consume some of those fat stores in their body to actually be able to survive and generate heat. Well, if you've got this mite that's sucking all the fat out of them, their ability to be able to sustain in wintertime diminishes. And so you see colony failures in the fall and winter time of the year because of that reason. That and lingering viral situations where we didn't get the mites under control. So chemical, non-chemical, again, I'm not going to preach to you which method to keep your bees. If you're going to do non-chemical, you can't do just one positive control by itself. You have to do lots of things in conjunction as part of an IPM strategy. Whether that's brood breaking, that's there's lots of ways to do that. That could be as simple as taking a queen out, requeening with a queen cell or a virgin queen, or you can actually, what a lot of beekeepers in Spain and Italy are doing, you cage the queen inside the hive for 16 days, release her, and then on day 21, which would be the brood emergence day, you go through and do a one-time oxalic vaporization. All the mites are out in the phoretic stage, out on the bees, and they're not in the brood. That severely hampers your brood production, and so it's a trade-off, but it is a way to get around using hard chemicals, using the natural, a more natural way of managing mites without using hard chemicals. Of course, drone trapping, putting the green drone frames in there, or you can actually put a foundationless frame in there toward the outside of the brood nest, and if you put foundationless with a starter script, a lot of times they'll have a high prevalence to build drones in those, so you can use those the same way if you don't want to buy that drone foundation or that green drone frame. Just got to remember to go back, that's a timing schedule. You've got to be removing that frame before that 24th day when all those drones hatch out. Otherwise, now you've got a crap ton of drones hatching out, but you've got a crap ton of mites hatching out too. So using that. Incorporating stocks that are tolerant to Varroa. I want to hit on that term, tolerant. We don't have any quote-unquote resistant stock. I know I see a lot of stuff marketed on the internet as, well, it's resistant, Varroa resistant. No, it's Varroa tolerant. They still have mites. They just have innate abilities, whether it's grooming, chewing, removing of infested pupa, whatever it is. Those bees are better at dealing with mite levels. They still have mites. So don't get sold on the resistant stock. The best stock at dealing with Varroa is the Africanized honeybee, and the reason, and it still has Varroa. The only way that it deals with it is they swarm and swarm and swarm. So they're constantly breaking their own brood cycle. So there is something to be said for breaking a brood cycle in order to help keep your mite levels in check. But just be aware that when somebody's trying to sell you that $55 queen or some kind of special queen, it's tolerant, not resistant. Screen bottom boards used to be, a lot of our bee catalogs used to sell them as IPM bottom boards. Now mostly you just see them as ventilated or screened. Very few mites actually drop off when the bees groom them and fall through the screen. Yes, it's a small percentage. Yes, every little bit helps, but just putting ventilated or screened bottoms on your bottoms of your hive is not going to eliminate your mite problem. So a lot of people will use that in conjunction with powdered sugar dusting. The problem I find in our area with powdered sugar dusting is it creates a fire ant problem. And now you got all this powdered sugar that's going to go on the ground underneath your hives, and those ants sure do appreciate it. And your bees are, I find, if you continue to dust them with powdered sugar, they become pretty cranky. I know Brushy Mountain used to sell this big bellows thing, and you can pump all this sugar in there and coat the hive. But then you're also coating everything inside the hive with that powdered sugar too. And then about the second or third time you do that to the colony, they get real pissy, and they're coming out to greet you before you ever get to the hive. So, but those are things that you can do. They're part of a positive control. There are a couple of natural acids that are very weak acids that can be applied. Acetic acid, vinegar, there's been some studies on certain types of vinegar, applying it as a mist to help dislodge some of the mites, and then lactic acid, and then also, I can't think of the type of acid that's in milk. They've done some studies with it, but they're very, very ineffective at controlling the mites, but it's all something that we can do as part of a more natural chemical-free way of doing things. And then, of course, we've got our lighter chemicals. That's going to be your oxalic, your thymol, your formic, your hot guard. And I don't want you to be fooled. If you're putting these products in your hive to control a mite, it is still a pesticide. It doesn't matter if it's organically derived or not. It still requires you to wear proper protective equipment to apply those products in the hive. Some of them, and particularly formic and oxalic, if you ever get a big nose full of those, it's gonna burn, and it's gonna be you're gonna be hurt. So if you're gonna apply those products, make sure you read the label, apply per label. Sorry, let me turn this off. Yeah, make sure you read the label and obey. And then, of course, we do have our synthetic harder chemicals, whether it's amitraz. The two that are still on the market but not very widely used because there's so much resistance is your Apistan and Checkmite. But those break down into all sorts of nasty chemicals and contaminate your wax, so no need to put them in. There are a lot of beekeepers that are using amitraz. Again, but it is a little bit harder synthetic chemical. Some of the known Varroa tolerant stocks that you could incorporate, the Purdue leg chewing stock, that's the one I particularly like. But they do have a new variant. I've seen them out in on some of the ads, what they're calling the mite mauler. That's basically the original Purdue stock was based off of a Carniolan, so it's mostly a darker bee. They've since went back and bred it in with some lighter bees. So now they have some yellow, sort of yellowish variants, but they have a innate grooming behavior where they actually groom and chew the mites. Our Varroa sensitive hygiene, or VSH, that's the ones that actively sniff out the infested pupa, remove them. I'll show you some examples of that later on. At Minnesota Hygienics, similar kind of behavior. There's a lot of questions as to whether or not that may actually be the same stock that was reached by different methods. Ms. Spivak actually admits that the VSH program with VP Queens down there, they did their studies quite differently than what the Minnesota Hygienic did, but the behavior is very similar and the traits are very similar, so could possibly be very, very close and similar on stock. Russians, they've been around for a while. It's kind of hit or miss on what you're buying there. I do recommend, if you're going to buy those, to make sure you buy from somebody in the Russian bee breeder co-op, just so you're getting a little more control on how they do their breeding program. Saskatraz is a newer one that's by Oliveira's Honeybees Company. I have tried some Saskatraz queens just to evaluate them. I didn't think that they did very well. They didn't overwinter well, and they didn't seem to do very well with Varroa, but they seem to have luck with them in California. I just didn't have luck with them here. Local survivorship stock, there's a big push right now, whether it's through the Born and Bred program or whether it's through local clubs, to buy your queens local. If you've got a local queen breeder that's producing really good stock that's acclimated to your specific area, that deals well with mites, that's a great way, whether it's stock that survives every year without, maybe without chemical intervention or limited chemical intervention. That's the kind of stock we want to start incorporating into our own bee yards, so that we have some of those traits. Assessing colony strength. So this is something as beekeepers, I feel like it's not properly done in the springtime, particularly when we're trying to get bees out of winter, early springtime. Being able to actually look in there and determine whether there's an issue going on. Apples to apples, if this, Queen A, Queen B, you see over here, we're talking about February, early March here. Those bees are boiling out, brood patterns like that. But then this queen over here, we can see there's bees occupying all the frames, but very limited brood pattern. Yeah, they have capped honey. Yeah, there's bees in there. But that one would be a cause maybe to warrant maybe a little closer inspection. Maybe that queen's starting to slow down. Maybe I need to requeen. So all things we want to take into consider. Why is it important to be able to determine that? Well, it does help us to understand when requeening is necessary. Maybe to identify a problem before it becomes a problem, before we end up with a queenless situation. You also can understand that certain variables, whether it's viral situations from the mites or high mite levels, can also play a role in how those colonies look. So if you have one colony you didn't get successful mite control on, those viruses that are lingering in there can cause a situation where just have a slow buildup or very little brood being produced. And oftentimes I find that's hefted on the queens. We want to blame the queens, but they have done extensive research. Allie McAfee has done a lot of research with that. We always want to blame the queen for the problems, but sometimes it's the colony itself, not the queen. And in her research, they've actually taken queens out of colonies that were not doing so well and put them in a really huge populous colony that has had good health, and that queen picked up and was laying like crazy. And then they've taken the queen out of a really good colony and put her in the crappy one, and it still continues to decline. So sometimes there's things at a colony level we blame the queen for, but those variables, being able to pick up, hey, there's some issues here. Am I seeing little hairless bees that look shiny that don't have all the hair on them, or am I seeing deformed wing virus, the bees with the little bent back paperclip wings that are coming out, or am I seeing bees that are just sitting there on a frame and they look like they're trembling, which would be an indication of another virus. So there's things there at a colony level that can affect the outcome. So understanding and being able to recognize those issues. We'll go back to this. Understanding how certain races behave. Your Italians and some of those Italian carniolan variants build up really early in the spring. They require extra supplemental feeding, or they'll starve because they're putting brood on like this in February. So it's very easy if we get a cold snap for those bees to starve. We have to do some extra supplemental feeding. But if say this was a Russian or carniolan over here, we wouldn't necessarily be concerned. So this goes back to good record keeping, knowing what stock you have, and then also knowing what the traits of that stock are. So certain bees are very resource frugal. They overwinter on smaller clusters, but then they're slower to build up early spring. So understanding what you have, if we're looking at apples to oranges, that's where your note taking is going to come into play. And then also being able to, a management call we've got to make. Sometimes I see people and they've got these little colonies. They went from a double deep to now they're barely clinging on 2 or 3 frames. Well, I'm just going to keep feeding them baby. Well, they're going to be dead. There comes a point where you just got to cut your losses and cull them, and that's a management decision. And I know sometimes we want to try and keep them alive and baby them, but sometimes we've got to cull out the weak ones and then cultivate off of those that are doing well. Another important item is understanding the cluster dynamics. This is going to be very beneficial for your overwintering success, your fall management, your winter, but then also as we transition from winter into the early part of spring, this is going to allow you how to best know how to set up your colonies for that fall and winter season. Do we need to condense the hives? Are they shrinking down? Do we need to take away extra equipment, condense them down into 5-frame nukes or multi-story nukes, or do we need to condense them down into a single 10-frame box? Understanding how that cluster is going to move, what resources are there. So we're actually going to have to inspect and see whether we're doing hefting to see how much food's in there, or actually looking physically at the frames in the hive to see whether or not those bees have food and have it next to where the cluster is going to be. That's a great way to understand why frame feeders work so well. We put those frame feeders in the hive. Yes, you have to open the hive, but they work well because you can position them right next to the cluster of bees, put the food right where they can take advantage of it and they can grow it. So understanding how that cluster is going to move up throughout the winter season. Also, with regards to things like hive rotation, the bees are going to move up as winter progresses. They're up in that uppermost box. Now we've got all these devoid combs down below. Reversing those bodies, allowing them extra room to build up is going to keep you from having early season swarms. But then also understanding that we may have to do some additional supplementation, particularly if we go back and we have that colony like over here, and they're all up top. The clusters moved up top. So we're going to have to do some additional supplementation with those to get them through. So understanding how the cluster moves, how they access food, and where to put supplemental feeding for your colony is going to help with your overwintering success rate. Recognizing problems. There's a lot of observations that can be made at the entrance of a colony to be able to tell whether or not, okay, well, I definitely need to make an inspection here. But then there's also stuff inside the colony that we can observe. And this is a situation where we need to properly be able to identify pests or diseases, whether it's a mite issue or whether it is a lingering disease issue that's causing our problem, but then also to give if we're going to call in our apiary inspector, to give them a start. Hey, I've got this issue, I think this is the issue going on, so we kind of give them a start. This particular book right here, Honeybees, Diseases and Pests is free for download. It's from the Canadian Association of Beekeepers. You can actually download it and print it yourself. If you have to buy the spiral-bound version of it in color, I think it's about $38. But if you've got a color printer at home, you can print off all those nice color pictures, and it's for free for download. So it's a really good field manual, particularly if you're not particularly good at identifying pests and diseases out in the bee yard. So as mentioned, exterior of the hive, we can make lots of observations about what's going on. Certainly, left top here, see pollen being brought in. That's not always an indicator that the bees are building brood or that we're queen right, but certainly if we're seeing lots of pollen come in, the bees need that extra protein to produce brood. So there's a good indication there that we do have a colony that's queen right and building brood, but certainly that's not always a go-to. This time of the year or even earlier in the year, we go out to the bee yard, we're seeing that on the entranceway. We had a hive that's dying out, and that's a good indicator you had robbing. You got all these little pieces of wax out. You're seeing bees come and go in that hive, but you think that, well, there's bees in that colony, and then you're seeing all this debris. It's been robbed out. Those are just bees that are going in there to get those resources. So that's an observation when we make an entrance. One of our diseases, chalk brood. A lot of people don't notice it on the frame because they just see, well, that's some moldy bee bread or pollen. They don't think anything of it. But on our entranceways, that's typically where we would notice it. We see the bees dragging out these little chalky mummies. A lot of times, early part of the spring, with wet weather and lack of nectar flow or limited nectar flow, stress on the bees, we can see some chalk brood. But as nectar flow picks up and get a little bit drier weather, a lot of times it goes away. But that is an issue where if it doesn't go away, certain Italian bees are more susceptible to it. Sometimes we have to requeen. For those of you that install packages, or if we're talking about early spring, and people, well, I've got all this bee poop on my lid, or I got bee poop on the outside. And if you just shook packages, well, all those bees have been cooped up for who knows how many days inside that little wooden box. They got to poop. So sometimes you get some streaking on the outside, but then certainly we have cold weather and in a warm spell, the bees are going to come out and poop. Sometimes they poop on the hive. Now, if we were seeing streaking like that, now we would be concerned for nosema, or the old nosema, the nosema apis presented like that, where you had all this poop on the outside of the hive, poop on the inside. But the newer nosema ceranae does not always have these characteristics, so it's harder to identify. And they do know from testing, even though we haven't been seeing all of this kind of stuff, that the nosema is very much out there. There's a lot of studies being done on not so much viruses, but now maybe nosema being a problem in some of our overwintering success. And again, I would expect this morning, after all that cold spell, you're probably seeing some of this. I got several of our new beekeepers that just went through bee school. They called me this morning. Well, what's this white thing? Why are my bees dragging it out? Why are they setting it on the entrance? Well, we got cold. Had some chilled brood, some chilled drawn brood. We're dragging it out. As long as we're not seeing tons of that, not a concern. But certainly something that you're going to see on the entranceway, particularly if we get cold weather, or you do a hive inspection and you break up some of that drone brood, you're going to see them drag out the pupa and the larvae that you damaged. Inside the hive, I know for a fact this year we had a lot of people that were contacting us, contacted myself in February. They went out, well, I had bees that were flying, and then they pop the top and they find this. It's the bees all clustered together, and they're all kind of froze there on the frames. See there, is actually a queen there, you can't see it. There's some limited brood there, and a lot of them were finding resources. Now that could be indicative of a viral situation from mites, or it could have been that the bees just could not break cluster to get over to the food that was there. So that's where some of that cluster dynamics, making sure we put food, if we had to put bee candy or fondant right on top of the cluster, or get some food right there where they can take advantage of it. But sometimes maybe because of those bees getting the fat sucked out of them by the mites, they just they don't make it. So and then of course right here, clear case of starvation, but also we see bees that go down in these cells like this. A lot of times you'll see bees that die out late winter, early spring, that have food that are down in cells like that. The bees actually go down, usually on the other side you'll find brood. They'll actually go down in those cells, and they're what we call eater bees. They go down in those cells and they try to generate heat that'll radiate through that frame, but usually they've kind of dwindled way down, the clusters dwindled way down, such that we had some other lingering problem that caused that situation when it died. Right now our little friend, the wax moth, is out and about, so I've seen some hives that were dead outs that they can cleaned up, that are loaded down with webbing and cocoons, so they are out and about. That's kind of the difference. A lot of new beekeepers and even experienced beekeepers can't tell the difference. You'll get caught, well, I've got wax moths or I've got small hive beetles. Those two are often confused with each other when they're really young and really small. The larval stage in both cases is the destructive phase, but because in both cases, whether it's wax moths or small hive beetles, they're tunneling through your combs, damaging your wax, and looking at locations on the frames. Wax moths you're typically going to find on brood or areas where you've got pollen or bee bread left over. They're there for that residual protein. Even though you can't see it when the bees hatch out and emerge as adults, they leave behind a little shed cocoon in there, and so that's nice residual protein that the wax moth will bore through there and eat. They're not interested in the honey, but if you find frames that have capped honey that were left over in a dead out or a hive that's really weak, and you see all these little maggots boring through the honey, that's a pretty good indicator that's a small hive beetle. So where they're at and what frame they're on is a good way to determine. But then also as the wax moth gets older, it gets a whole lot larger. Hey, it's good chicken feed, good trout bait. Or if you've got reptiles like I do, I've got a bearded dragon. She loves those big old fat wax worms. Hey, put them to use for something. They're not much good for cleaning up my frames, but they're good for something else to eat. And then I do want to mention that we have a lot of questions that come up, whether it's new beekeepers or beekeepers that have never had a slime out from small hive beetles. If they ever get in those frames and slime that honey because they basically eat and poop all in it, it becomes a nasty fermented mess. You can't put that back in a hive, the bees won't clean it up. So you're better off to scrape it back down to bare foundation or pop that comb out and put a new wax starter in there, so the bees won't utilize it. Whereas the wax moth stuff, if you freeze it and clean it up a little bit, they will. So inside the hive, a couple of our foul brood diseases. Over here is our European. You can see you've got some miscolored, misshapen larvae, kind of melted down, kind of yellow looking. Typically will have a smell associated with it. You notice it's affecting the larvae. Over here, our American foul brood, we can see that everything is affecting post-capping, so it's affecting the pupal stage. So one affects the larva, the other one affects the pupa. American foul brood makes greasy cappings, sometimes has a sour smell to it, sometimes not. And then if you look down at the cells, you can actually hold the frame away from you, looking down in the edges, and you actually see that's like a blackish brown scale. Don't expect most beekeepers to ever have to deal with that, but we did have the last few years, they were related to a commercial beekeeper that relocated their operation or relocates their operation seasonally to the North Carolina mountains. We did have 2 bee yards that were surrounding a commercial yard that got infected in Henderson County with American foul brood. So, they basically had to slash and burn all their beehives. So they dump soapy water on them and then burn all the bees and the equipment. So it's out there, but I don't expect most of you to have to deal with that. The reason I bring these two up is because there are mite conditions like this right here that is often confused with European foul brood. We have had cases, this is what we call PMS or parasitic mite syndrome or mite brood syndrome. They've tried to get away from the PMS just because the lady beekeepers don't like that. But that was the first term for it, PMS. But it is often, you can see, even here, we see some larvae that's sort of not right color, doesn't look right, and then we see a spotty pattern just like we do with this European foul brood. So those things can often be confused from one another. We have had beekeepers that have tested when they have these mite viral issues where it's causing this brood syndrome. It does not test positive for European foul brood. We have had some that have administered terramycin when it was like this, and with feeding and terramycin it kind of cleared up. So there's some question there as to whether maybe there was a little bit of foul brood going on too, but we are certainly seeing viral situations where those two can be hard to identify. So when you start seeing that, and if you ever see that, get your mite situation under control, that's a good time to call in your apiary inspector and say, hey, I don't know whether this is foul brood or this is a mite situation. Get them out here to look at it. And as mentioned, this is your hygienic behavior. So we see on this brood pattern, we've got some cells that are missing. It looks like maybe she was missing some cells, but then we look over here and we see the bees are actually chewing cappings on there. So sometimes we can actually look at a colony, and this goes back to record keeping and knowing if you're buying one of those hygienic stocks. Sometimes we can go to a frame and it looks sort of spotty, but that's because the bees are actually uncapping those infested pupa and removing them, so they're doing their job. So if you buy one of those stocks or you think you may have one of those stocks, that's a good indicator, is sometimes seeing where the bees are actually chewing those caps. But also a lot of beekeepers well, it's a real spotty pattern, but so remember to take notes, remember what you bought as a queen, where you got the queen from. If you don't know, you buy a queen from one of your local people, ask them whether their bees have hygienic behavior. And there are ways to test for this. If you suspect hygienic behavior, most of us don't have liquid nitrogen lying around like Marla Spivak and some of those do. The old index card trick works. Take an index card and lay it on a piece of cardboard, cut out the shape of it, so it's about a 3x5, and then lay that on top of a frame of cat brood, and actually take a toothpick or a little twig and pierce all those cappings, and then stick it back in, and after 24 hours, you should have a good portion of that brood that you've damaged, the cappings that you've damaged, you should have that removed. If you have almost all of it, then you've got a lot of hygienic behavior. If you've got very little of it that's being removed, your bees don't have a whole lot of hygienic behavior. So that is an easy trick you can employ in your bee yard to determine whether or not you have some hygienic behavior or hygienic bees. Right now, this is the biggest headache all of us are fighting, halting the urge to swarm. I caught 4 swarms this afternoon right before I headed this way. I haven't been having any swarms. I've had very little swarm calls and very little swarms in my bee yard. I know last year the bees were very swarmy, but this year we really haven't had a whole lot of swarm, or I haven't, at least in my area. But aside from Varroa mite issues, halting the urge to swarm is where beekeepers are going to spend the biggest efforts they've got during the springtime. I'm going to touch on each one of these methodologies, but I'm not going to go into super descriptions on all of them. But high rotation, that's something you're going to be employing for us in our area, probably late February-ish. You've got that cluster that's moved up, empty combs down below if you're running double deeps. If you're running the 1.5 story configurations where you've got a deep and mediums or shallows on top of that. It may be that the cluster's moved up into those 2 shallows or 2 mediums, so now we can move those back down. So you can, or if you're running all mediums, they may be up in the top mediums and not the bottom, so we can move multiple boxes down if we're doing those kind of configurations versus a double deep where we would just move the uppermost deep with the bees. A case where we would not want to do that is if that cluster is split between both boxes and we've got brood, and now we've created a broken brood nest situation, and it's going to be very inefficient for them to warm it at that period of time in the year. But it is a very good technique to use that really early springtime, just to give your bees additional room to expand, store resources, and it does buy you some time. Checkerboarding, lots of different ways to do that, whether it's taking out frames of brood that we're going to utilize for other things, or whether it's taking out frames of honey and pollen. Early season, we had a lot of beekeepers that were reporting bees just packing in tons and tons of pollen into the brood nest. The queens didn't have a place to lay it. You can actually pull those frames out, put a drone comb back in place, or bare foundation if that's what you got. Continue to feed. That way the bees are not just packing all that stuff down in the brood nest. The biggest thing there is either we're taking away bees and brood, or we're taking away resources and giving the bees extra stuff to work with, whether it's bare foundation or whether it's drawn out, so they still have room to continue to expand. Equalizing hives, if I go back to that example that we had of the really strong hive and the one that was sort of dwindling, or the one that was not quite as strong, we can actually borrow resources from the one to get it such that we have 2 colonies that are fairly the same in terms of the number of brood, the amount of bees in there, so that way that when we're managing on the management on them is fairly equal as far as when we put additional boxes on, or when we super them for nectar flow, and things of that nature. Splitting and nukes, we'll talk more about that on the next slide, and division as well. Supering, often is associated with the nectar flow, but the term super comes from Latin, which is supere, which means to place above. So it doesn't matter the size of the box. I want you to realize when we talk about super, we're putting boxes on top, no matter the size. In the early spring, or this time of the year when we're getting ready to be on our major nectar flow, we're adding boxes such that the bees have a place to store nectar. But early spring, if that colony is split between, the brood nest is split between both those double deeps or multiple boxes, and we can't do rotation, we can actually super them, doesn't matter what size box. We've now allowed room for expansion and nectar storage, and so we bought ourselves some time until we can do some splits, or we've got queens available to be able to do splits, nukes, things of that nature. So it is a very useful thing. Shaking bees. Now this, when you buy a package of bees, the technique that those commercial producers use, they put queen excluders on, they put open brood up, they encourage those nurse bees to come up, they shake them out into a big box, and they put them in a little box, and then they go in that little box that you pick up for $100-some bucks. So with a queen that they've never met, and they come from all different colonies. We can do the same thing on a smaller scale. If we've got colonies that are really strong, and we've got colonies that need to be boosted up in the springtime, we can go pull frames of open brood where you're going to have nurse bees, of course, making sure your queen's not walking along those frames. What I do is I take an empty nuke box out, I'll put a nuke cover on the bottom of it, and then I take another nuke cover to close it up. And so what I'll do is I'll pull several frames of open brood that's got nurse bees, shake it. I'll go to another colony that's really spilling over with bees, pull several frames of open brood that's got nurse bees, shake it in that box, keep it closed, and then now I've got all these nurse bees that I can gift to a colony that's population is not as good or needs a little boost. So we can actually use that in a smaller scale to boost up weak colonies or to equalize. So it is a tool that we can use to help prevent some swarming. False swarm method, you know, a lot of us have run into that situation right now. We go to our colonies and there's cap queen cells or cells that are getting ready to cap off. I know when the box is full of bees, it's hard to do, but we go through the best accepted way to stop it at that point is to catch the swarm ourselves. So we have to go through, find the existing queen, remove her, several frames of brood, the same process of making up a split or a nuke, remove her over, several frames of brood, frame of resources, and then we can set that hive up in our own apiary somewhere else, and then leave behind 1 to 2 of those ripe cells or soon-to-be ripe cells for the bees to hatch out. And we'll talk a little bit more here in a minute about what we can do with some of those extra cells that are there. Apiary method, I want you to be aware of that, particularly those of you that are looking to do your journeyman testing. That question, you will see the Apiary method again. It is an older method. It's very labor intensive. It does work for swarm management. I couldn't, in my apiary, implement it because it would require too many visits to too many hives, and I don't have that much time. But it is a very useful swarm management technique. There's lots of things you can do with it, whether it's preventing swarming and recombining the bees back to produce a huge honey crop. You can rear queens with that method. You can do splits with that method. So it is very useful, but it is more labor intensive than some of the other techniques. It does require multiple visits back to the colony that you're utilizing. But I do want you to be aware, in case you happen to want to take your journeyman, study that method because it will be on the exam. So making nukes and splits, very useful this time of the year and a little bit before now. We could have been making up some splits. We had lots of bees, lots of brood. You need several frames of capped and or open brood when we're going to make up our split. Usually 1 to 2 frames of resources. When I say resources, open nectar, bee bread, pollen. I don't tend to like to take capped honey. I'd rather have that open nectar with the split. Certain times of the year I will put a 4 frame of brood in there. We don't want to transfer over a lot of frames that have tons and tons of eggs on there. The reason for that is, particularly if we're going to put a mated queen in there, they could decide not to accept your mated queen and to start rearing off a queen cell off of one of those young larvae or those eggs that are going to hatch out into a young larva. The only case where we want to do that is in the case if we want to do a walk-away split. And the walk-away split is the same thing, except we're not going to be adding a mated queen or a queen cell or a virgin queen. We're just going to let them raise out a emergency queen. Problem with that is you've got to be aware you're going to be looking at a 45-day plus period where you're not going to have any new brood emerging. That's really great if we want to break that brood cycle and have limited Varroa in that nuke or split we're making up, but we're going to probably have to go back and add additional bees and brood to that walk-away before they're going to have new brood hatching out. So just be aware of that. Let's see, I mentioned that here. If we're going to do that, we won't frame, if we're going to do a walk-away, you do want frames that have eggs on there and young larvae. If, you know, I mentioned the bees, when they hatch out, they have those cocoons that they shed. On that older, darker comb, the bees can't actually cut down through the cell wall because it hardens in there. You can actually take on a frame like that, if we're going to do a walk-away, you need to actually take the end of your hive tool and kind of press down in several areas around cells that have eggs or a really young larva in it. That way they can actually draw a cell out and down like a queen cell should be. Otherwise, what they do is they start floating royal jelly back in there and you end up with that little crappy little turd, almost like a super seizure emergency cell where it's not exactly the right orientation. So frames that have newer wax that have eggs on it are great because the bees can actually chew down through there. Otherwise, if you're going to use one of those old black combs in your walkway, you need to kind of push down around some of those cells on the frame to give the bees a place to actually pull down a true queen cell where it's a little better. if we're making a regular nuke or split up, you know, there's lots of ways to go. We can purchase a mated queen if we have a mated queen that we made, or somebody in the club's got, we got that. Right now, lots of beekeepers are going in their hives and they got all these cells, and then all of a sudden, in the process of going through their hives, all of them start hatching at one time. They got all these virgins. Sometimes you can get a free virgin queen that way, but then also some of the queen producers will actually sell virgin queens at a cheaper price because they didn't have to mate them, so you can get those. That's a way to requeen your split or your nuke. And then again, those ripe queen cells or swarm cells can be used also. Hive division, I mentioned that. That is a split on steroids. If we've got a double deep or whatever our setup is, and all the boxes are just full of bees of brood, we can take some of that, set it off on a new bottom board. We don't really care where the existing queen is, and the reason we don't care is because in about 3 or 4 days we can make a return trip and figure out where she's at, because wherever the fresh eggs is at, she's in that box, and the other one should be starting to build cells. So you know, that's a way to basically separate one colony, create two, so you're kind of splitting on a mass scale there. Again, you could let them rear out their own queen, or you could add a mated queen in doing so. I know a lot of the textbooks and things you hear, you got to move these splits 2 miles away or 5 miles away. As long as you're moving it to the other side of your apiary, I don't like to put nukes and splits right next to the hive that I was making the nuke or split off. Move it to the other side of your apiary, you're good. Why? We're removing frames of capped and open brood. There's nurse bees there. They're not abandoning that brood. The foragers will fly back to the parent colony, but we'll be left with all those nurse bees. So we don't have to move it 2 miles away or 5 miles away to disorient, because we're not trying to get a bunch of foragers in. So, intro into another thing that I think is well worth your time to investigate, and going back to our goals there. There's a workshop coming up in Person County. Brian Fisher, who lives not far from here, is actually going to be doing a workshop for Person County beekeepers here in a couple of weeks. It'll be a hands-on training event. If you get a chance to go to a hands-on queen rearing event like Brian does, Born and Bred is great, but they're not doing anything this year. But those hands-on classes are a whole lot better than attending a webinar or something like that. Sure, you learn the techniques, but you don't get the skill set that you do doing those hands-on, actually physically seeing how to set up starters and finishers, and how do you set up your mating nukes, and how do you graft, how do you know what to graft, and there's different ways to go about it. So, grafting is manually removing the larva to a cell cup, a right age larva, and then we put it in a cell starter. There's lots of different ways to go about that, but a lot of people don't have the hand and eye coordination, or they can't pick out, or maybe they don't have the right setup to graft. So there are graftless methods. There's a Nicot and a Genter system. There's the Miller method of notching. So like we talked about with our walkaway, you can actually pull a frame out that's got eggs and young larvae, and you actually cut these, take your hive tool or something, or some kind of cutting tool, and then kind of notch out these little triangular shapes along the bottom of the foundation, and then the bees will draw those queen cells down off of where those sort of triangular shapes are at, because what we want it to be those frames that have the eggs and the young larvae on them. That's another method. Cell punching, you can actually take like a little coring tool and punch out multiple cells that have eggs and young larvae in them, and kind of twist them up in a cell cup. And then again, our frame of eggs with young larvae, like we did with the walkaway, is another way that you can get away without graftless. Lots of different other methods. Swarm box method, cloak board. Of course, you got to know about mating nukes or queen castles, or whether it's regular nukes. The thing I want to get across with queen rearing is, if you're going to do it, you need, just like that drone tracking frame. Everything on the queen rearing schedule is time-based. It has to be done on this day. Doesn't matter what the weather's doing, whether it's pouring rain, you better set up a 10 by 12 tent, pop-up, easy-up tent up over the beehive and get it done. Or take an umbrella or whatever. It's all timing based on this amount of days. It's got to be done on this amount of days. The cells have to come out, or they all merge, and then you've got a mess. So everything is timing oriented with the queen rearing schedule. You know, and then you could yourself become a local source for quality local raised queens. And good resources if you're wanting to start queen rearing or learn more about it. Scientific Queen Rearing, it's a good book. Queen Rearing Essentials, Bee Sex Essentials, and Increase Essentials. Those are all good book resources. Local beekeepers or commercial beekeepers in your area that raise queens. Brian, I know, is very generous with his time if people want to come out. But I'm certain there's some other people in this club that do queens and would encourage you to come out if you want to learn how to queen rear. And you can see their methodology. Lots of different methodologies on how they do their stuff, but it's pretty neat to go to different people who raise queens and see how they set up their stuff. It'll help you out. Of course, queen rearing workshops like the one I mentioned, or the born and bred. There are some online classes that you can take, but as mentioned, the hands-on is much better. So, right now is the perfect time to prime yourself for the queen rearing maybe you want to learn to do next year, or maybe you're going to take a class this year but you're not quite ready. But right now we've got all those bees building those nice swarm cells that from day one were destined to be a queen. We didn't have to interfere, we didn't have to do anything. So we go to our colony, maybe we're doing our fall swarm method. Maybe we already had a swarm and we're inspecting and we find all these queen cells. Good goodness, there's 24 queen cells over here. You don't need to leave but 1 or 2 cells in that parent colony. Otherwise, you run the risk of having secondary swarms off that hive. And sometimes I've seen it where colonies will just continue to cast swarms such that by the time they get done swarming, it was a double deep with supers full of bees in there. Now there's barely enough for a 5-frame nuke. So we need to get some of those cells out of there. They don't need 24 cells to make a queen. But don't let them go to waste. We can trim those cells off a frame if they're in a place where it's wax foundation versus plastic, and we can get our hive tool underneath there, trim them out. We can put them in a nuke. We can put them in a queen castle. We can put them in a mating nuke. Or you can simply take a frame that's got 2 or 3 cells on it, put it in a split that you're going to make up, or a nuke that you're going to make up. So don't let them go to waste. They make really good, high-quality queens, and it's a great way to kind of get an idea on the timing there as far as, okay, well, I've got these ripe cells, I'll put them in. How long does it take the queens to get mated such that now I have a queen-right nuke or a queen-right mating nuke? And with this way, I'm not buying queens. You've got a queen on standby, so I can go out to the nuke that I put these cells in a few weeks, and I'll have a mated queen. If I've got a colony that's not doing well, I want to requeen it. Having a nuke boxes on hand as beekeepers, extra nuke boxes on hand at all times is great. A queen castle is great, but there's lots of stuff right now when the bees are actually trying to build swarm cells and actually trying to build those queen cells. We can take advantage of it. And if you make up some queens to have on hand, to fix your own problems in your own bee yard, or you can start nukes that you can then sell to another beekeeper, or you can keep those nukes and continue to raise them. So in case maybe you get later in the summer and you have a colony that goes queenless and you've got a laying worker situation, now you can merge that nuke with that colony. You've got it back queen right. So lots of good reasons to use those cells and keep them. The downside of this is when we're talking about our queen rearing, when we graft or graftless, those of us that raise queens, we're usually going to colonies and selecting for certain traits, whether it's gentle bees or whether this colony every year it makes 4 supers of honey or 6 supers of honey, or this one here, every time I check the mite levels on it, it very seldom has any high mite levels. So, you know, when we're doing queenery as queen raisers, we typically select for those kind of traits. But with this, we're just picking the swarm cells, the ones that build cells. We don't get to necessarily choose those traits unless we're just going to go to certain colonies that have those traits that start to build swarm cells. So that's kind of a downside. We don't get to play any part in the genetic selection. And then supering for the nectar flow, again, you know, knowing, I find this is a problem for beekeepers because we get hung up on this time schedule every year where, well, every year, this such and such date, I go and I put supers on. Well, if you've been doing that the last 3 years, you're not going to be in line with where we're at this year, because this year we're kind of more in line with what the typical blooms would be as far as tulip poplar. Whereas at my house in Dallas, the last 3 years, we've had tulip poplar start blooming the second week of April. This year, they just started opening this week. So it's kind of more in line with where our typical bloom cycle would be. As beekeepers, we need to be able to shift and adapt with those crops, but also the weather and weather patterns as far as what our bees are doing. Typical bloom for tulip poplar, as mentioned, would be into April, early May, and it would persist pretty much for the month of May. You know, you need to have your honey supers on in advance, not wait until your brood nest is being back full of nectar, or otherwise you're going to have a swarm on your hands, and then you're going to come back and your supers are still going to be empty. So get them on in advance. Of course, you know, if you were going to do sourwood, then you'd have to have them off in June and then haul up for the monocrop to have sourwood in July. There's plenty of other sources that are out there other than tulip poplar. I want you to be aware of that. But tulip poplar for most of our area is the big nectar flow. But certainly henbit, purple dead nettle, dandelions, clovers, ornamental cherry, crepe myrtles, different varietals of locusts, hollies, boxwood. There is some basswood around, and all of those things do produce nectar of some quantity. At my area there in Gaston County, I get a pretty good crop of holly the early part of April. Typically, I can fill about 2 supers up with mostly holly nectar. I mean, I'm sure they're bringing in henbit and nettle and other stuff too, but when those hollies are blooming, I can fill up 2 drawn-out supers fairly fast. This year, because we got that real cold snap right there the first week in April, all the holly blooms turn black, and very little holly nectar coming in. I was expecting to add more supers a couple weeks ago, and I went back and I put 2 supers on, and I had 2 supers on originally. I had maybe 1 partially filled, so the bees certainly missed out on that nectar flow, even though the equipment was there. So sometimes some of these weather patterns can greatly affect our actual nectar flow. And then sourwood, if you're going to haul bees for that, you know, you're looking at a late June, early July, depending on your altitude, and then it's a 28-day bloom cycle on most varietals. And then, of course, then at that point, we would remove, harvest, treat our bees if necessary, and then store our supers for the year. We do have a fall goldenrod and aster flow here in the Piedmont mountain region, and it's very temperamental on how good it is. Most beekeepers just plan on their bees having that, and certainly if it's particularly dry year, then the bees don't bring in a whole lot of that, and so you end up having to do additional supplemental feeding, particularly if you pulled off a lot of honey in the summertime or springtime. So that is kind of a temperamental flow, but it is out there. Most of us are just going to leave that to the bees versus trying to harvest it. Another great tool you can use right now, whether it's catching your own bees or whether it's catching somebody else's bees, swarm trapping. We set swarm traps around the perimeter of your own apiary, and what you'll find is if you do that, yes, occasionally you'll catch some of your own swarms, but when your hives act as an attractant. there's the smell of honey, there's the smell of propolis, everything that bees like. And so what I used to never mark any of my queens until I started raising queens to sell, but I would set swarm traps on the perimeter of my apiary and I would catch everybody else's little $35 mark queen. So thank you for your contribution. They're very easy. They used to be cost effective to make swarm traps, but now plywood is $45 a sheet. But if you can still come up with some scrap wood, or if you've got somebody that's already got some made up, they used to be about 25 bucks to buy. I can't imagine what it would cost now because of the price of lumber, but they're usually fairly economical to make. What size box is that I use? It's basically the equivalent of a 5-frame nuke with a shallow nuke super on there. So the depth of that is 15 and 5/16, and it comes up to 40 cubic liters. And where did I get that magic number? Tom Seeley's done lots of studies on the best size for swarms. Most swarms will go in at 40 cubic liters. Yes, you won't get some of the really huge ones, but hopefully they'll land on a tree or something in your yard and catch them. Smaller ones, the average size ones, and most of them will fit in that 40 cubic liters. If you look at that box, the hole is here. It sits 5 frames over here. They have all this extra room where they can hang down off the bottom of the frames. If you put new wax or newer foundation, that's good because it allows those bees room to sort of festoon and hang there and start comb building inside that swarm trap. Where to place them? Approximately 12 feet off the ground. That doesn't look like 12 feet off the ground because the bees don't read the book. That particular swarm trap right there caught 8 swarms last year. And it's on a piece of 4.5 feet split rail. So they don't always read the book, and so this 10 to 12 feet getting up on a ladder and trying to take the swarm trap down, not always the best idea, but I do find getting them up off the ground does work better than just sitting them on a high stand. What I do around my apiary is I put 4 by 8 by 10s in the ground about 2 feet, and then so they're up about 8 feet by the time you bury them in the ground, and then I just lag hold to those 4x4s. Certainly you can ratchet strap them or lag bolt them to sort of landmark trees. If you've got a fence row or a tree that kind of stands out on the edge of your yard, that's a good visible tree. That's a good place to put a swarm trap because that's maybe a location that bees are going to see as they come through there and swarm. Okay, well, that tree kind of juts out. It's a good place. Fork trees, of course, if you're not going to lag bolt it and you're going to try to ratchet strap it, getting it up in that fork of that tree gives you a place to kind of support the weight of the box and the bees once they're in it. Frequent swarm sites. So if you've got a place where every year you get a swarm call, you got this business or somebody calls you every year, they got a swarm over there, or frequent swarm places, that's a good place where I want to set up a swarm trap. Set that swarm trap up there. I get 2 swarm calls over there every year. Just put that swarm trap, get them in there, so I don't have to climb a ladder, I don't have to knock them out with a pole catcher, or I don't have to cut limbs. Hopefully they'll go in that swarm box, and then I can just go over there and close that thing up at night and haul it back to the bee yard. So what do I use as bait? Lemongrass works well. There's lots of commercial lures that are out there, whether they're pheromones or Swarm Commander, different ones that are out there. All of them, with the exception of the pheromone ones, like Swarm Commander and a couple of other ones, they all have a lemongrassy, citrusy kind of smell. Citral is another product that you can use. It's the active ingredient that's put in them little citrine gummies that's in the Claxton fruitcakes. So maybe there's actually a use for your Claxton fruitcake other than a paperweight. You can actually dig the little gummies out of it and actually put them in your swarm trap, and it does work. We had somebody that bought some of the little citrine gummies and used that as a swarm bait. So it does have that citrusy smell. It does work, but I typically use lemongrass oil. And then the other thing is I have lots of queens from time to time that are not up to snuff, so I pinch them off and give them a nice alcohol bath, put them in a little rubbing alcohol, crush them up, leave them to sit in that alcohol, so now that alcohol is infused with all that queen pheromone, so I can dab a Q-tip down in there, or a cotton ball, and then throw that in my swarm trap along with some of that lemongrass oil. So now kind of got the best of both worlds. Propolis, you can take your hive tool out this time of year when that propolis is nice and gummy. Get you some of it, smear it on the inside of your swarm traps, what I do is, you're going to put it, if you've got some drawn out comb, some of that old dark comb that you're culling out of your hives, that's a great comb to put in your swarm traps. A lot of the end bars on there already have some propolis, so you kind of got propolis already on there from that old frame. Plus you've got that drawn out comb that's going to give those bees a head start when they move into your swarm trap. Things I did not touch on as far as sustainability, woodenware. Lots of places to buy woodenware. Oddly enough, right now, and me and another buddy that's out in Shelby were talking about this past weekend because he had bought a bunch of lumber and was going to buy some more to start. He's been building his own equipment. It's now become more economical for me to buy it from a bee supplier and assemble it than I can buy the wood and actually put it together. Unless you're running a sawmill or you've got somebody that's going to give you some sawmill lumber at a cheap price, buying lumber and building hives right now is just not the way to go. It was the other way around now. I don't see how the bee supply places are able to continue the prices they are, so you may see a skyrocket if the lumber prices stay up on some of our bee supplies too. So certainly whether you're buying their equipment at the bee supply place or whether you're buying wood to manufacture your own, purchase a quality wood or purchase a quality item. Yes, the commercial grade stuff with all the knots in it works just fine, but sometimes spending that extra money on that better quality maybe give you a little bit longer before it starts rotting out on the side of your box or something like that. Of course, making sure you're covering your boxes with a quality exterior paint or some type of a treatment there. There is a minimalistic approach that we did not talk about. For those of you that tuned into Sam Comfort, that we did as our spring series for the state, he was building boxes out of scrap wood and using bamboo cooking skewers that you make shish kebabs to basically make his own little Warre hives that he was using for his queener. So there are cheap ways to get by that you put bees in work. And then the old tried and true, the Kenyan top bar, you can make those out of 55-gallon drums with little wood staves across them. There's lots of different ways to make them very cheaply if you just want to have bees and manage some bee colonies and not have to worry about honey and all this other stuff. So there are minimalistic ways to get around buying all this Langstroth equipment. And then honey, wax, etc. If you're going to be beekeeping and you're going to be selling all this stuff, you need to have a market developed for it, or you need to know what the market in your area is, who you're going to be selling to, what price, what do those items sell for, where can I sell them, where can I market them, how can I make my product stand out in an area that's saturated with honey. So you need to be thinking about those things, because all of those things are not necessarily profitable things that are going to make you loads and loads of money, but that's stuff that's going to buy your woodenware, or it's going to pay for your mite treatments, or it's going to pay for all that sugar that you're going to feed the bees. So all of those things are value-added products that you can sell, but you've got to have a market for them. And if you're going to be having those products to sell, then you need to be working on it. So with that, I will open up to questions. Yes, sir.
When you catch a swarm with a root, are you going to replace that queen?
Yeah, and typically what I will do is, yes, I do replace the queens. What I'll do is, and that's another thing I didn't hit on, thank you for bringing up the question, is when I catch a swarm in those swarm traps, I'm usually checking every week. So if I know that the bees because I've got some in some remote locations, so if I'm checking every week, I know that the bees have been there sometime within the last week, and then they're usually good to go ahead and relocate. What I will do is I've got a area where I don't have my production stuff, where I can kind of isolate those ones that I catch in a swarm trap, or if I go out on swarm calls and catch traps. And so I actually put them in a nuke box and then double stack them with a second nuke body on top. Let them start laying, evaluate them, see how they're doing. But yes, before the end of summer, going into fall, I'll requeen all of those. Just not because I'm worried about the genetics on them, but typically those can be, you know, multi-year-old queens. And so you don't really know what the longevity of those is going to be. So I'd rather have a young queen in there to overwinter. So yeah, I do requeen those, but I usually do that in summer or fall and requeen them prior to overwinter. So yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Excuse me, has anybody ever come up with a reason for the colony collapse disease?
They've gotten away from that term, but yes, the biggest thing there is we know is for one the viruses from the mites, but then we also know that nutrition plays a part, available forage, and then also what they're finding is overuse of pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. So you get sort of a trifecta of things there that are playing a role, not necessarily killing the bees outright, but they all work together to create what we were seeing, or what we were terming as colony collapse there, with the bees just slowly just diminishing until there's nothing left in the hive. So yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing as the causation there, is kind of all three of those things together.
They have a treatment for it?
What's that?
They have a treatment for it besides requeening and trying to add to it?
The best management we can do right now is maintaining younger queens that are highly productive in your colonies, and then mitigating your mite levels, however you're doing that, whether it's positive controls or chemically, and then also making sure your bees are fed. So supplementing as necessary seems to be the way to go. More questions? Yes, sir.
So one of our colonies, I think about it, that's failing. Quite a bit of the comb. So I believe she started laying a lot more drones.
Yes.
So each cell is getting expanded out, larger for that drone. So I replace her. I'm just thinking about the value of my drone comb. Will the workers rework that comb back down to a worker size?
No, they don't typically rework that back down. Once it's drone size, if you put that in another colony, like say if you just took it out of that colony and put it in this other one that doesn't have a failing queen in it, they'll start laying drones in those expanded cells. So what I do with those is, if there's a lot of them or a lot of drone brood on them, where sometimes we get a drone laying queen, it's either dispose of them, or I'll work them once I can scrape that drone brood out and work them back out toward the outside edge, where they'll backfill it with nectar, and then it just becomes a honey frame.
Is it possible to have overpopulation after you've caught so many swarms that you keep more and more colonies in your apiary?
Apiary density is, that's kind of variable. It depends on your lot. I mean, if you've got 25 hives in your yard, that's not going to affect what forage is out there for them, since they're going out. But if you've got a small lot, that might be troublesome for you. But I typically try to limit mine to about 50 per yard, so I run 4 to 5 bee yards. Some of them have nukes, some of them have honey production colonies, but I typically try to limit them to about 50 hives, no more than 75. But just having like a dozen, or and you catch some swarms, no, you're not gonna overwhelm the area by having that many hives in there. But yeah, there is something to say about apiary density as far as sort of the transmission of high Varroa levels and stuff like that from the colony and stuff like that. But as far as available forage, you're not gonna overwhelm the area. Any more questions? Thank you, guys.